Have you ever found yourself apologizing for something you didn't do? Defending yourself against accusations you know are false, yet somehow feeling guilty anyway? Or perhaps you've watched someone you care about change completely. Someone who was once confident and decisive, now constantly second-guessing themselves, isolated from friends, convinced that you're the problem when you try to help? Here's what makes this truly unsettling. In the 1960s, a Yale psychologist discovered that 65% of ordinary people, teachers, engineers, salespeople, would administer what they believed were potentially fatal electric shocks to an innocent stranger. Not because they were evil, but because someone in a lab coat told them to. 65%. Most of us want to believe we'd be in the other 35%. But the research suggests otherwise. Tonight, we're exploring something that exists in the space between influence and control, between persuasion and coercion. Dark psychology. The tactics we'll discuss aren't just theoretical. They're being used right now in relationships, workplaces, online interactions, perhaps even in your own life without you realizing it. These aren't supernatural powers or mysterious dark arts. They're systematic applications of psychological principles, exploiting the same cognitive mechanisms that help us trust, connect, and cooperate, which means all of us are vulnerable. But here's the twist that makes this entire exploration worthwhile. The moment you can name what's happening, you've already begun to resist it. Understanding these tactics doesn't just protect you, it fundamentally changes how they work on your mind. Dark psychology isn't a formal branch of academic psychology. You won't find university courses titled How to Manipulate People 101. Rather, it's a term that emerged to describe the study and application of psychological influence in ways that serve the manipulator at the expense of others. It encompasses tactics used by those high in certain personality traits. We'll explore these shortly, as well as the broader principles of persuasion that, when stripped of ethical constraints, become weapons rather than tools. And here's something most people don't realize. Manipulation exists on a spectrum. Some individuals wield these tactics with cold calculation, viewing relationships as games to win and people as objects to control. But others use them almost unconsciously. Defense mechanisms learned in childhood or absorbed from their own experiences of being manipulated. This doesn't excuse the behavior, but it reveals something important. These tactics spread. They replicate. Understanding them breaks that cycle. Over the coming hours, we'll move through this landscape methodically. We'll trace the historical research that first illuminated how influence operates. We'll examine the personality patterns that predispose some people toward exploitation. We'll dissect specific tactics, each one backed by rigorous scientific study, each one explained not just in what it is, but in how and why it works on the human mind. We'll understand the neurological vulnerabilities that make us targets, and we'll close with practical wisdom on recognition and protection. This is science, not sensationalism, but science presented in a way that allows you to absorb it gently, to let understanding settle as you drift towards sleep. So take a breath, get comfortable. Let's begin our exploration of the manipulation tactics that shape more of our world than we'd like to believe. Long before psychologists coined terms like dark psychology, humans were observing and cataloging the ways people influence one another. Ancient philosophers wrote about rhetoric and persuasion. Machiavelli, in the 16th century, penned The Prince, a political treatise that would later lend its name to an entire personality trait, Machiavellianism. Characterized by cunning, manipulation, and willingness to deceive for personal gain. But the systematic, scientific study of influence truly began in the 20th century. The aftermath of World War II cast a long shadow. Researchers grappled with urgent questions. How did ordinary German citizens participate in atrocities? How did propaganda shape entire populations? Solomon Asch conducted his conformity experiments in the 1950s, demonstrating that people would deny the evidence of their own eyes to conform to group opinion. Participants were asked to identify which of 3 lines matched a target line in length, a simple perceptual task. But when Confederates in the room deliberately chose the wrong answer, about 33% of participants conformed to the incorrect majority at least once, even when they knew it was wrong. This was shocking. It revealed that social pressure could override even basic perception. In the 1960s and 70s, researchers began to synthesize findings into coherent frameworks. They identified specific techniques of influence and demonstrated that these techniques worked across cultures and contexts. Meanwhile, clinical psychologists were documenting patterns in abusive relationships, noting how certain individuals seem to possess an uncanny ability to control and manipulate their partners. By the 1990s and early 2000s, these separate streams of research began to converge. Personality psychologists identified trait clusters associated with manipulative behavior. Social psychologists mapped the specific tactics manipulators used. Neuroscientists started to understand the brain mechanisms that made manipulation possible. The term dark psychology emerged to label this convergence of knowledge about influence used for harm. What makes this history important isn't just academic curiosity. It's the recognition that manipulation isn't some mysterious dark art. It's psychology. The same mechanisms that allow us to cooperate, to trust, to form societies, but turned against us. The researchers who studied these phenomena did so not to create a manipulator's handbook, but to shed light on human vulnerability and protect potential victims. In 2002, psychologists Delroy Paulhus and Kevin Williams identified what they called the Dark Triad, 3 personality traits that predispose individuals toward manipulation: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and subclinical psychopathy. Narcissism involves grandiosity, need for admiration, and lack of empathy. Narcissists use relationships for narcissistic supply, the admiration and attention that feeds their inflated self-concept. But here's the unsettling part. Research consistently shows narcissists are exceptionally skilled at making strong first impressions. They appear charming, confident, magnetic. Studies find observers rate narcissists as more attractive and likable when first meeting them. The very traits that should warn us away actually draw us in initially. The manipulation begins before you even realize someone is narcissistic. Machiavellianism, named after the political philosopher, involves manipulativeness, cynicism, and viewing relationships strategically. High Mocs see life as a game to win through cunning, not cooperation. They're willing to lie and deceive with little guilt. Research shows Machiavellianism correlates with higher cognitive ability. These individuals aren't just willing to manipulate, they're often skilled at it. Subclinical psychopathy involves high impulsivity, low empathy, low anxiety, and callous disregard for others. Unlike clinical psychopathy, this exists at non-criminal levels in the general population. These individuals can be charming and persuasive, but don't feel guilt or remorse the way most people do, freeing them to engage in harmful behaviors without emotional distress. Paulhus and Williams found that, while related, these traits aren't identical. All 3 show low agreeableness, but narcissists show more extroversion. Psychopaths show low anxiety, and Mocs and psychopaths show low conscientiousness. Individuals high in Dark Triad traits are most likely to employ manipulation tactics systematically and without remorse. Understanding these patterns helps us recognize who might be prone to the tactics we're exploring. Before we dive into the darker applications of influence, we need to understand influence itself. and no one has contributed more to this understanding than Robert Cialdini. Born in 1945, Cialdini spent his career studying the psychology of persuasion, conducting research, going undercover in sales organizations, and synthesizing decades of findings into a coherent framework. In 1984, he published Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion, which would become one of the most cited works in social psychology. Cialdini identified 6 universal principles of influence, later expanded to 7, that operate across cultures and contexts. These principles aren't inherently manipulative. They're features of how human minds work. But when used without ethical constraints, they become the building blocks of dark psychology. Reciprocity. Humans feel obligated to return favors. When someone does something for us, we experience psychological tension until we reciprocate. This evolved to facilitate cooperation, but it can be exploited. A manipulative partner showers you with gifts early on, creating a sense of debt that's later called in through emotional demands. Commitment and consistency. Once we've made a choice or taken a stand, we experience pressure to behave consistently with that commitment. A manipulator might get you to agree to a small request first, then gradually escalate. You agreed to the initial commitment, so rejecting later requests feels inconsistent. Social proof. We look to others when we're uncertain about how to behave. If everyone else is doing something, we assume it must be correct. Manipulators create false consensus, surround you with people who agree with them, or cite statistics about what everyone else is doing. Authority. We're raised to respect authority figures. This deference helps society function, but it also makes us vulnerable to anyone who can establish themselves as an authority, whether legitimate or not. Milgram's experiments, which we'll explore shortly, demonstrated how profoundly authority can override moral judgments. Liking. We say yes more often to people we like. Similarity, compliments, cooperation toward mutual goals, and physical attractiveness all increase liking. Manipulators mirror your speech patterns, find commonalities, flatter you, present themselves as teammates rather than adversaries. Scarcity. We value things more when they're rare, or when we might lose access to them. Only 2 left. This offer expires tonight. Scarcity creates urgency that bypasses careful deliberation. Unity, added in 2016. This refers to the feeling of shared identity, the sense that we are part of the same in-group as someone else. Family, hometown, university. These shared identities create powerful bonds. Manipulators exploit them to create an us against the world mentality that isolates victims from potential help. What makes Cialdini's work so important for understanding dark psychology is this. These principles work whether we want them to or not. They're wired into how we process information and make decisions. An ethical person uses them to facilitate genuine persuasion. A manipulator uses them to override your better judgment. The difference isn't in the principles themselves. It's in the intent and respect for the person being influenced. The term gaslighting comes from a 1938 stage play called Gaslight by Patrick Hamilton, later adapted into a famous 1944 film starring Ingrid Bergman and Charles Boyer. In the story, a husband systematically manipulates his wife into believing she's losing her mind. He dims the gas lights in their home, but insists they haven't changed. He hides objects and claims she misplaced them. He denies events that clearly happened. Gradually, the wife begins to doubt her own perceptions, her own memory, her own sanity. The term gaslighting entered popular vocabulary to describe exactly this kind of psychological manipulation. A deliberate attempt to make someone question their reality. But what exactly is gaslighting from a psychological standpoint? Recent research has begun to unpack the mechanisms. In a 2025 paper published in Personality and Social Psychology Review, researchers Willis Klein, Suzanne Wood, and Jennifer Bartz proposed a theoretical framework for understanding gaslighting based on prediction error, minimization, and social cognitive processes. Their model suggests that gaslighting may work by exploiting our fundamental need to make sense of the world and our reliance on close others to help us do that. Based on this framework, here's what researchers believe happens. Our brains constantly generate predictions about what we'll experience next, then compare those predictions to what actually happens. When there's a mismatch, a prediction error, we update our models of reality. Normally, this system helps us learn and adapt. But in close relationships, we grant certain people what researchers call epistemic trust. We trust them to help us understand reality, to verify our experiences, to shape how we see ourselves and the world. When a person we've granted this epistemic trust begins to systematically contradict our perceptions, our brains face a dilemma. The prediction error is large. What we experience doesn't match what this trusted person is telling us. But because we trust them, we may begin to adjust our model of reality to fit their narrative, rather than our own experience. This could explain why gaslighting is so much more effective when it comes from someone close to us. A stranger contradicting your memory might be dismissed, but a romantic partner, a parent, a longtime friend, someone you've learned to trust, their contradictions carry weight. Your brain treats their input as reliable data, which means their distortions can actually reshape your sense of what's real. Gaslighting typically involves several tactics. First, denial. That never happened. You're making things up. I never said that. The gaslighter flatly contradicts your memory of events. Second, trivialization. You're too sensitive. You're overreacting. It wasn't that big a deal. This invalidates your emotional response, making you question whether your feelings are justified. Third, countering. Are you sure you remember that correctly? I think you're confused. The gaslighter positions themselves as having a more accurate grasp of reality than you do. Fourth, blocking or diverting. When you try to discuss something important, the gaslighter changes the subject or refuses to engage. Fifth, forgetting or denial. I don't know what you're talking about. They claim to have no memory of events you know occurred. And finally, trivializing your perceptions. You're imagining things. That's crazy. They suggest your perceptions themselves are fundamentally unreliable. Research on gaslighting's effects has found profound psychological impacts. A 2024 study in the Journal of Interpersonal Violence examined gaslighting in romantic relationships and found strong correlations between gaslighting experiences and anxiety, depression, and reduced self-esteem. Victims reported hypervigilance, constantly monitoring their own thoughts and actions to try to figure out what's real. They experienced diminished self-worth and social withdrawal. Some researchers described gaslighting's effects as resembling symptoms of trauma, anxiety, dissociation, a fragmented sense of self. What makes gaslighting particularly insidious is that it targets something fundamental: your ability to trust your own mind. Other forms of manipulation might exploit your emotions or your cognitive biases. Gaslighting undermines your very capacity to know what's real. And because it typically happens in close relationships, romantic partnerships, family dynamics, sometimes workplaces, the victim often has no external reference point to verify reality. The gaslighter might isolate them from friends or family, creating an echo chamber where only the gaslighter's version of reality exists. Sociologist Paige Sweet, in her 2019 paper, The Sociology of Gaslighting, argues that gaslighting works particularly well when it mobilizes existing social inequalities. In relationships with power imbalances, whether based on gender, race, class, or other factors, the person with more power can more effectively convince others that their version of reality is correct, Society already provides them with credibility that the victim lacks. A male partner telling a female partner she's being hysterical. A white supervisor telling a person of color they're being paranoid about discrimination. The gaslighting doesn't happen in a vacuum. It leverages pre-existing vulnerabilities and stereotypes to maximum effect. Understanding gaslighting helps us recognize it. If you find yourself constantly apologizing, constantly doubting your memory, constantly wondering if you're too sensitive, these might be signs. If someone's narrative of events never quite matches yours, but they insist with such certainty that you begin to doubt yourself, that's gaslighting. The antidote is external verification. Talk to people outside the relationship. Keep written records of events. Trust your perceptions, even when someone you care about contradicts them. Because gaslighting only works if you accept the premise that your reality is less valid. It ain't theirs, and it never is. Imagine meeting someone who seems perfect. They text you constantly, shower you with compliments, declare you're their soulmate after just days or weeks. They want to spend every moment together. They give you gifts, plan elaborate dates, make you feel like the center of their universe. It's intoxicating. You feel seen, cherished, special in a way you've never experienced before. Friends might even say you're lucky that you've found the one. And then, gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, things shift. The compliments become criticisms. The attention turns to control. The affection is withdrawn when you displease them. You find yourself desperately trying to recapture that initial magic, wondering what you did wrong, working harder and harder to earn back the love that once flowed so freely. Here's what most people don't realize until it's too late. That initial intensity wasn't love. It was a strategic tactic called love bombing. And the shift wasn't a change in how they felt about you. It was always the plan. The overwhelming affection at the beginning serves a specific purpose: to create such a strong emotional bond so quickly that by the time the devaluation starts, you're already too invested to leave easily. The term originated in the 1970s, used by members of the Unification Church and the Family International to describe their recruitment tactics, flooding potential members with attention and affection to create emotional bonds. Margaret Singer, a psychologist who studied cults, wrote about love bombing in her 1996 book, Cults in Our Midst, describing it as a coordinated effort to make recruits feel valued and welcomed, creating a sense of belonging that made leaving difficult. But love bombing isn't just a cult recruitment tool. It's increasingly recognized as a manipulation tactic in romantic relationships, particularly by those high in narcissistic traits. Psychiatrist Dale Archer has described love bombing's pattern with the acronym IDD: intense idealization, devaluation, and discard. Let's break this down. In the idealization phase, the love bomber overwhelms their target with affection and attention. Early, frequent declarations of love. I love you. You're my soulmate. I've never felt this way about anyone. All within days or weeks of meeting. Constant contact, texts, calls, wanting to know where you are and what you're doing at all times, framed as romantic interest rather than monitoring. Grand gestures, expensive gifts, elaborate surprises, public declarations of devotion, and intense future planning, talking about marriage, children, growing old together, before you've even had time to know each other properly. Research on love bombing is still emerging, but several studies have illuminated its dynamics. A study conducted at the University of Arkansas examined love bombing behaviors and their connection to narcissism. Researchers Claire, Strutzenberg and colleagues created a love bombing scale and found that higher levels of narcissism correlated with greater use of love bombing tactics. Narcissists, the research suggests, use love bombing not out of genuine affection, but as a tool for what they call self-enhancement, using relationships to regulate their own self-esteem and create a positive self-concept. The bombardment of affection serves multiple purposes for the manipulator. First, it creates a strong emotional bond quickly, fostering dependence. The target becomes emotionally invested, often before recognizing any red flags. Second, it establishes a high baseline for the relationship. When the devaluation phase begins, the target will work desperately to return to that initial high, blaming themselves for the shift rather than recognizing the pattern. Third, the intensity can cloud judgment. When someone is love bombing you, your brain is flooded with dopamine, oxytocin, and other neurochemicals associated with bonding and pleasure. This neurochemical cocktail can override critical thinking, making you more susceptible to overlooking warning signs. The devaluation phase begins when the love bomber has secured the target's emotional investment. Now, their behavior shifts. Criticism emerges. "I love you, but you could dress better." Or, "Why can't you be more like?" Withdrawal of affection. Suddenly, they're distant, cold, less available. The person who couldn't go an hour without texting now takes days to respond. Gaslighting. Denying the shift, insisting you're imagining things, or being too needy. Guilt tripping. Making you feel responsible for their mood changes. "If you really loved me, you'd..." The target scrambles to recapture the idealization, often sacrificing boundaries, tolerating behavior they wouldn't have accepted before, all in hopes of bringing back that initial magic. The discard phase, when it comes, can be sudden or gradual. The love bomber either ends the relationship abruptly, sometimes finding a new target to idealize, or maintains the relationship but at a much lower emotional investment, keeping the target in a state of perpetual striving. And here's the truly manipulative part. Often, the cycle repeats. After a discard, the love bomber might reinitiate contact, sweeping back in with renewed affection, promises that things will be different, maybe a brief return to idealization. This intermittent reinforcement, unpredictable rewards mixed with punishment, is one of the most powerful behavior modification tools known to psychology. It's the same principle that makes gambling addictive. You never know when the next reward is coming, so you keep trying. Research on the psychological impact of love bombing found that victims often experience confusion, anxiety, and diminished self-esteem. A 2024 study published in the International Journal of Innovative and Applied Psychology examined the connection between love, bombing, narcissism, and emotional abuse, finding that victims reported significant mental health impacts, including depression, feelings of worthlessness, and difficulty trusting future partners. Understanding love bombing helps us recognize it early. Genuine affection develops gradually. Someone who barely knows you can't possibly love the real you. They love a projection, an idealized version they've constructed. Healthy relationships involve mutual pacing, respect for boundaries, and consistency. Love bombing, by contrast, feels urgent, intense, and overwhelming. If you feel swept off your feet but also a little uneasy, trust that unease. If someone seems too good to be true, professing deep love before they truly know you, that's a red flag. Not every intense romance is love bombing. But when intensity combines with pressure, isolation, and a sense that you're losing yourself in someone else's vision of who you should be, that's when to step back and evaluate what's really happening. In 1961, Stanley Milgram began experiments that would forever change our understanding of human nature. Growing up Jewish during World War II, he grappled with a haunting question. How had ordinary Germans participated in atrocities? He believed there must be something unique about German culture. To establish a baseline, he first tested American participants. What he discovered would shake him to his core. Participants arrived at Yale believing they were part of a learning and memory study. They were assigned the role of teacher while another participant, actually an actor, would be the learner. The teacher's job: administer a memory test and deliver electric shocks for each mistake, increasing voltage with each error. The shock generator had 30 switches, from 15 volts, slight shock, up to 450 volts, marked XXX. The learner, strapped in an adjacent room, would begin making mistakes. At 75 volts, he'd grunt. At 120, complain about pain. At 150, demand release. At 300, scream in agony and stop responding. Throughout this, the experimenter, stern in a white lab coat, would calmly issue prods. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on. The shocks weren't real, but participants believed they were inflicting genuine, dangerous pain. Milgram had asked colleagues to predict how many would continue to maximum voltage. The consensus: 1 to 3%. The actual results were staggering. 65% of participants continued to 450 volts, even believing they might have killed the learner. 100% continued past 300 volts. These weren't monsters. They were ordinary Americans, and they didn't enjoy it. Many displayed visible distress, sweating, trembling, some breaking down in tears. But they continued. Authority overrode their moral. Objections. Milgram conducted 19 variations, finding that obedience dropped when the experimenter wasn't physically present, when teachers had to touch the learner directly, or when another teacher refused to continue. Proximity to authority increased compliance. Distance from the victim also increased compliance. And seeing others resist gave people permission to resist themselves. Milgram introduced the concept of the agentic state, a psychological condition where individuals see themselves as agents carrying out another's wishes rather than as autonomous actors. When in this state, people's moral considerations shift from "is this right?" to "am I doing what the authority wants?" Modern replications with proper ethical safeguards have found similar results, suggesting our susceptibility to authority hasn't diminished. The lesson is clear. We are all vulnerable. In the 1990s, psychologist Jennifer Joy Freed noticed a pattern in how perpetrators of abuse responded when confronted. They engaged in a predictable sequence she termed DARVO: deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. This three-step process has since been recognized as one of the most effective and damaging manipulation tactics. Denial comes first. "I never did that. That's not what happened. You're making this up." The denial can be total or partial, minimizing what occurred. This forces the victim to spend energy proving something happened rather than addressing the harm. The attack follows. Unable to credibly maintain denial, the perpetrator attacks the victim's credibility or character. "You're too sensitive. You're crazy. You're trying to destroy me." The attack might dredge up past behavior or assassinate character. The goal: shift focus from the perpetrator's behavior to the victim's supposed flaws. The reversal is most insidious. The perpetrator claims to be the real victim. "You're abusing me by making these accusations." This is harassment. They position themselves as wronged and persecuted. The original victim becomes recast as the offender. This is psychologically disorienting and often effective with observers. Research demonstrates DARVO's powerful effects. In a 2020 study by Sarah Harsey and Jennifer Freyd, participants read vignettes about sexual violence scenarios. When exposed to DARVO tactics, they rated the victim as less believable, more responsible, and more abusive. They rated the perpetrator as less abusive and less responsible. DARVO effectively shifted perceptions. But could education counteract this? A second experiment found that participants who learned about DARVO first showed different judgment patterns. They perceived victims as more believable and perpetrators as less believable. Education didn't eliminate DARVO's influence, but significantly reduced it. DARVO works by exploiting cognitive dissonance, leveraging victim-blaming biases, manipulating our sense of fairness, and creating confusion for victims about their own reality. It appears across contexts: intimate partner violence, workplace harassment, sexual assault cases, even institutional responses to accusations. How do you protect yourself? Recognize the pattern. Document what happened. Written records counteract denial. Seek external perspectives. DARVO thrives in isolation. Maintain boundaries. If someone consistently uses DARVO rather than taking accountability, the relationship may not be salvageable. Most people, when genuinely confronted with harm they've caused, feel remorse and attempt to make amends. DARVO is a pattern of refusing accountability incompatible with healthy relationships. To truly understand why manipulation works, we need to go deeper than tactics and personality traits. We need to understand what's happening in the brain when someone is being manipulated. Over the past few decades, neuroscience has begun to illuminate the neural mechanisms that may make us vulnerable to influence, the ways our cognitive architecture can potentially be exploited, and the brain changes that appear to occur in those subjected to prolonged manipulation. This isn't abstract. This is biology, and understanding it empowers us to recognize and resist. Let's start with something fundamental: prediction error minimization. Your brain is constantly generating predictions about what will happen next based on past experience. When reality matches the prediction, all is well. When there's a mismatch, a prediction error, your brain updates its model. This learning mechanism is essential for navigating the world, but it creates a vulnerability. When someone you trust provides information that contradicts your direct experience, your brain faces a conflict. The prediction error is large. In normal circumstances, you'd update your model based on the new information. But if the trusted person insists your perception is wrong, research suggests your brain may begin to weight their input more heavily than your own senses, especially if this happens repeatedly. Research on gaslighting has applied this framework to explain how reality distortion might work at a neural level. In close relationships, we grant certain people what researchers call epistemic trust. We trust them to help us understand reality. This trust has adaptive value. We can't directly verify everything ourselves, so we rely on trusted others. But when that trust is weaponized, when a gaslighter systematically contradicts our perceptions, this prediction error minimization system could go haywire. Based on the theoretical framework, we might start adjusting our internal model to match their narrative rather than our own experience, leading to the confusion and self-doubt characteristic of gaslighting victims. Now consider the role of the amygdala, a brain structure crucial for processing emotions, particularly fear. When we're in a threatening situation, the amygdala activates, triggering stress responses, but it also plays a role in forming emotional memories. Experiences paired with strong emotion get encoded more deeply. Manipulators, whether consciously or not, often create situations of intermittent stress and relief. The stress activates the amygdala, potentially making those moments more memorable. The relief, when it comes, feels profound, not just absence of stress, but positive emotion. Research suggests this emotional roller coaster may create powerful conditioning. The victim's brain could begin to associate the manipulator with both threat and relief, creating what's known as a trauma bond, a paradoxical attachment that's extremely difficult to break. This might explain why victims of abuse often struggle to leave, even when they logically know they should. It's not weakness or poor judgment. It's neurobiology. The amygdala has learned to associate this person with both danger and safety, creating an internal conflict that reason alone can't resolve. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive functions like planning, decision-making, and impulse control, may also be compromised under conditions of chronic stress. Studies on individuals in abusive relationships have found evidence of altered functioning in the prefrontal cortex, particularly in areas involved in emotional regulation and decision-making. When you're constantly in a state of heightened alert, research suggests your higher-order thinking can become impaired. This could explain why victims of manipulation often report feeling like they can't think straight or make decisions they later can't explain. It's not that they've suddenly become less intelligent. Their prefrontal cortex may be effectively hijacked by stress, making clear reasoning nearly impossible in the moment. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter associated with reward and motivation, plays a crucial role in love bombing. During the idealization phase, intense affection and attention trigger dopamine release, creating feelings of euphoria. When the devaluation phase begins and those dopamine hits become unpredictable, the brain enters a state similar to addiction withdrawal. The victim becomes focused on regaining that high, even if it means tolerating increasingly harmful behavior. This is intermittent reinforcement at a neurological level. Unpredictable rewards create stronger compulsions than consistent ones. Research on authority and obedience has identified neural correlates of the agentic state. When people shift responsibility to an authority figure, activity appears to decrease in brain regions associated with self-reflection and moral reasoning. fMRI studies have shown reduced prefrontal cortex activity during obedience, suggesting that authority can genuinely impair our capacity for independent moral judgment at a neurological level. Chronic manipulation can lead to changes in brain structure over time. Studies of individuals who've experienced prolonged psychological abuse have found alterations in the hippocampus, crucial for memory, and increased amygdala activity even in the absence of immediate threat. These changes can persist long after the relationship ends, manifesting as hypervigilance, difficulty trusting, and emotional dysregulation. This isn't weakness. This is neurobiology. The brain adapts to survive, and when survival means constantly monitoring for threats, the brain rewires accordingly. Understanding these mechanisms provides validation for victims who blame themselves. Your brain was doing exactly what brains do, trying to make sense of information, seeking rewards, bonding with important others, deferring to authority, adapting to chronic stress. Manipulators exploit these normal, adaptive processes. The vulnerability isn't a flaw. It's a feature of being human. But knowledge is protective. When you understand how these tactics work on a neurological level, you can recognize warning signs earlier and seek help before the rewiring becomes deeply entrenched. We've explored the landscape of dark psychology, the traits, the tactics, the mechanisms. Now comes the practical question. How do we protect ourselves? The answers lie in awareness, boundaries, and community. Awareness begins with education. Exactly what you're doing right now. Simply knowing these tactics exist makes you less susceptible. Research on DARVO showed that participants who learned about the tactic before being exposed to it judge situations more accurately. But awareness goes deeper than intellectual knowledge. Pay attention to your gut feelings. If something feels off, even if you can't articulate why, that discomfort is information. Our unconscious mind often detects patterns before our conscious mind can name them. Watch for specific warning signs. Rapid intensity in new relationships. Declarations of love within days or weeks. Pressure to commit quickly. Isolation. Someone who subtly or overtly discourages your connections with friends and family. Inconsistency between words and actions. Accountability avoidance. They never genuinely apologize. never take responsibility. Finding yourself constantly questioning your memory or perception. Being told you're too sensitive whenever you raise concerns. Feeling overwhelmed by attention. Being placed on a pedestal. Someone using their position or credentials to override your judgment. Boundaries are your defense. Healthy boundaries aren't walls. They're guidelines that communicate what behavior you will and won't accept. Setting them requires clarity about your own values. Communicating them clearly matters. I'm not comfortable with that. I need time to think. Don't speak to me that way. Simple, direct statements. You don't need to justify or over-explain. Enforcing boundaries requires action. Ending a conversation when someone becomes abusive. Limiting contact with those who repeatedly cross lines. Sometimes leaving a relationship entirely. Community provides essential protection. Manipulation thrives in isolation. When you have strong connections outside a potentially manipulative relationship, you have reality checks. Tell people you trust what's happening. Show them texts or messages. Don't let shame keep you silent. Manipulators rely on victims staying isolated and quiet. Professional help can be invaluable. Therapy for processing manipulation, rebuilding self-trust, working through trauma. Support groups provide community with others who understand. Document concerning behavior. Keep texts, emails, voicemails. Write down incidents with dates and details. This counteracts gaslighting by providing objective records and can be evidence if you need legal protection. Trust the pattern, not the apologies. Look at behavior over time, not isolated incidents. Real change involves sustained effort and accountability, even when uncomfortable. Remember, manipulation isn't your fault. Victims often blame themselves, but manipulators target normal human needs for connection and trust. Your vulnerability is part of being human. The responsibility lies with the person who chose to manipulate. Healing is possible. People recover, rebuild trust, and form healthier relationships. Knowledge, boundaries, community. These are your tools for protection and recovery. We've traveled through shadowed territory tonight. The tactics we've explored, gaslighting, love bombing, DARVO, authority manipulation, and more, represent some of the more troubling applications of psychological knowledge. We've seen how personality traits like those in the Dark Triad predispose some individuals toward exploitative behavior. We've examined the principles of influence that, when wielded without ethics, become tools of control. We've understood the neurological mechanisms that make us vulnerable, the ways our own brains can be turned against us through systematic manipulation. But here's the final, crucial insight that reframes everything we've discussed. These vulnerabilities aren't flaws in human design. They're features. The same mechanisms that make us susceptible to manipulation are the ones that make love, trust, and cooperation possible. Our tendency to defer to authority allows societies to function. Our capacity to bond quickly enabled our ancestors to form alliances and survive. Our willingness to adjust our perceptions based on trusted others' input prevents us from being trapped in solipsistic isolation. The prediction error minimization that gaslighters exploit is how we learn and adapt to a changing world. The manipulators aren't exploiting bugs in human psychology. They're weaponizing features. And that means protection isn't about eliminating these vulnerabilities. It's about developing discernment. Learning to distinguish between healthy influence and harmful manipulation, between someone who shares authority and someone who wields it as a weapon, between genuine love and strategic love bombing, between healthy adjustment to new information and gaslighting-induced reality distortion. Remember that 65% figure from the beginning? The shocking discovery that most ordinary people would administer what they believed were fatal shocks simply because an authority figure told them to? Here's what's easy to miss. Milgram also conducted variations where he changed the conditions. When another person, just another participant, not an authority figure, refused to continue, suddenly the real participant's obedience plummeted. Seeing one other person resist gave people permission to trust their own moral judgment again. This reveals something profound. Manipulation thrives in isolation, but resistance spreads through connection. One person recognizing DARVO and naming it reduces its power. One person refusing to comply with unethical authority makes it easier for others to refuse. One person validating a gaslighting victim's reality helps break the spell. The tactics we've explored work best when victims feel alone, when they doubt whether others would believe them, when they have no external reference point for what's normal, which means knowledge isn't just personally protective, it's socially protective. By understanding these tactics, you don't just defend yourself. You become someone who can recognize when others are being manipulated. You can be the person who says, "I believe you," when someone describes gaslighting. The one who identifies DARVO when a perpetrator tries to reverse victim and offender. The one who questions authority when it demands unethical compliance. Your awareness creates ripples. Dark psychology exists. That's the uncomfortable truth. Some people will use psychological tactics to serve their own interests at your expense. But those people are not the majority. Most humans, most of the time, engage in reciprocal, cooperative relationships. They respect boundaries. They take accountability when they cause harm. They value genuine connection over control. The existence of manipulators doesn't mean you should distrust everyone. It means you should develop discernment, the ability to distinguish healthy relationships from toxic ones. The science we've covered tonight represents decades of research by psychologists who dedicated their careers to understanding influence and manipulation. Stanley Milgram wanted to comprehend how ordinary people could commit atrocities under authority. Robert Cialdini sought to map the principles of persuasion to help people both use them ethically and defend against their misuse. Jennifer Freed studied betrayal trauma to validate victims' experiences and expose perpetrator tactics. These researchers worked not to empower manipulators, but to protect potential victims through understanding. You now carry that understanding. You know what the Dark Triad looks like. You know Cialdini's principles and how they can be twisted. You know the signs of gaslighting, the pattern of love bombing, the sequence of DARVO. You understand that authority can override moral judgment, that our brains can be neurologically hijacked through chronic stress and intermittent reinforcement. And you know the protective factors: awareness, boundaries, community, documentation, professional help when needed. If you're currently in a manipulative relationship, please know that leaving is possible. It's difficult, often frightening, sometimes dangerous, but it's possible, and resources exist to help you. If you've experienced manipulation in the past, know that your experience was real, that it wasn't your fault, and that healing is not only possible, but probable with time and support. And if you're fortunate enough to have never encountered severe manipulation, use this knowledge to recognize early warning signs, to support others who might be targeted, and to cultivate relationships built on mutual respect rather than control. The darkness we've explored tonight is real, but knowledge illuminates. Understanding these tactics reduces their power. Sharing this understanding with others extends that protection into community. And remembering that most human behavior tends toward cooperation, empathy, and genuine connection prevents the cynicism that can develop from studying the darker aspects of psychology. Thank you for taking this journey through dark psychology. If you found this exploration valuable, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. We'll continue exploring the full spectrum of human psychology, the beautiful and the troubling, the inspirational and the cautionary, always with scientific rigor, always with compassion, always with the goal of deeper understanding. Now take a deep breath. Let your mind settle. You've absorbed a lot of information tonight, and your brain will continue processing it as you sleep. Trust in that process. Trust in your growing wisdom. And seeing does. Rest knowing that awareness itself is a form of protection, a light you now carry into whatever darkness you might encounter. Sleep well.